let's talk about who won the Cuban Missile Crisis. How did the crisis begin?
In 1959, communist Fidel Castro overthrew the corrupt Cuban ruler, Batista.
Castro's moderate communism was initially popular in Cuba, wasn't it?
Yes, but relations with the US soon deteriorated. The US refused to trade with Cuba, and President Eisenhower allowed Cubans who'd fled the communist regime to train and arm themselves in Miami. This pushed Cuba into a relationship with the USSR.
Why were Cubans arming themselves in the USA?
Eisenhower had authorized a plan for the Cuban exiles to try to take Cuba by force. The attack, named the Bay of Pigs, was a disaster and simply pushed Castro further into the arms of the USSR.
I know the USSR was feeling threatened by US nuclear missiles on its border with Turkey.
Yes, in 1962, US President Kennedy warned the Soviet Union that the US wouldn't tolerate nuclear weapons in Cuba, and was assured that it wouldn't be an issue. But in October, a US spy plane photographed missiles in Cuba, missiles capable of hitting most of the US without warning.
Were the missiles installed because the Soviet leader Khrushchev wanted to support Cuba?
Yes, but he also wanted to use them as a bargaining tool to try and get US missiles out of Turkey.
What could Kennedy do? If he did nothing, the US would look weak and would be left open to nuclear threat.
He could attack Cuba by air, but that could lead to war with the USSR. Another option was to invade Cuba, remove Castro, and destroy the missiles. But that would almost certainly lead to World War III. Instead, on October the 22nd, Kennedy announced there would be a naval blockade of Cuba to stop more missiles getting in. All Soviet ships would be stopped and searched, and the missiles already in Cuba would be removed.
What did Khrushchev do? Events progressed rapidly, didn't they?
Yes. On October the 23rd, Khrushchev sent a letter saying the USSR would ignore the blockade. 3 days later, he sent a second letter, offering to withdraw the missiles if the US promised to lift the blockade and not attack Cuba. The next day, he sent a third letter, demanding that the US remove its missiles from Turkey. A US spy plane was shot down over Cuba, and Kennedy was put under pressure to retaliate. He responded to the second letter, and Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles, while Kennedy promised to take the missiles out of Turkey.
Could you argue that the USSR won the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yes, Cuban independence was guaranteed, and the US withdrew their missiles from Turkey.
Could you argue it was a victory for the USA?
Yes. Soviet missiles were withdrawn from Cuba, and Kennedy showed that he wouldn't be bullied and wouldn't use needless aggression.
The crisis highlighted the need for communication, so a telephone hotline was installed between Washington and Moscow, and in 1963 both countries signed a nuclear test ban treaty.
The crisis also strengthened moderate opinion in the US. People recognized that the destruction of civilization was a big price to pay, and that they could tolerate a communist Cuba. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev was seen as weak for his handling of the crisis, and was replaced in 1964.
We hope you have enjoyed using Revise on the Move and wish you the best of luck in your exams.